because it's exactly, the question is, why does your swimming pool or pond go green? It's because the nitrogen comes in, and there are organisms in your swimming pool that are able to fix that nitrogen. They're algae, they're free-living algae. They're called something like volvox. And they're blue-green algae. There are about 5 or 6 species of them. And they use exactly the same mechanism of locking away the oxygen in one part so that the other part of that tiny little algal cell can transform the nitrogen. And then once you've got nitrogen in the system, all the other organisms that are there can utilize it. Okay, because dust is full of nitrogen and phosphorus, because dust is soil. Okay, most dust is soil. All right, so that's the one idea of the fungus. The other very interesting one, and this one I would ask you to observe next time you're out in the veld, is a very interesting one in that it's again got to do with phosphorus. Phosphorus has to be right adjacent to the root surface in order to be taken up. So we've got all this hyphal mat going out there, bringing the phosphorus in. It's now at the root surface. Now imagine you're a root, a grass root or a tree root, in dry soil. How do you prevent yourself from drying out? Okay, just think about this. It hasn't rained for 3 weeks. The soil is dry. The root has to stay wet, hydrated, because otherwise it'll just all shrivel up and die. So what does it do? It exudes sugar through the outer wall of the root. So it puts sugar on the outside of the root. That sugar attracts fungal hyphae, and the sugar and the hyphae and the sand all stick together like a sock. We call it, the proper word is a sheath. It's called a root sheath. So if you go into sandy soils of our savanna areas, you can pull many of the grasses out, and when you pull them out, many of the roots will have little brown socks on them. Okay, they're called root sheaths. And by having brown socks, sandy socks, they are keeping the humidity, the moisture content, immediately adjacent to the root, keeping the humidity high, so that any phosphorus that comes into the immediate vicinity, like 1 micron, 2 microns from the root surface, can immediately be taken up. So what's fascinating for us, and we did quite a lot of studies on it, you can go from the Kruger National Park on the east of the country all the way through to Namibia, and you can pull the same grass species out. And depending on how sandy the soils are and how little rainfall there is in the system, the socks get thicker and thicker. So when you're in Mkuzi or when you're in the south of the Kruger where there's a reasonable amount of rainfall, you'll have like a little thin running sock on. By the time you get to the Free State, you've got like a tennis sock on, okay? And by the time you get to Namibia, you've got a rugby sock on. Okay, get the picture. And that's exactly what these plant root sheaths do. And we've done some interesting experiments, it's not anecdotal, where we've taken grasses from different places and retransplanted them and seen if the thickness of the sheath changes. Yes, it does. If you add phosphorus to the system, so it's immediately adjacent to the root sheaths disappear completely. Okay, so the association to make those little red nodules is a few hundreds of thousands of years old with a bacterium. The association with this fungus, like you get on your bread when you leave it in the bin for too long, that fungal association with plant roots is probably close to 1.5 million years old in the African continent. It's ancient in terms of evolution and the primitiveness of how a system has evolved. So it's very interesting that, you know, we sit and fiddle around in the lab trying to make phosphorus more available. That's why you buy fertilizer, NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. So you add those to your plants. So now moving up in scale a little in terms of the size of the organisms, what would you guys call these? Caterpillars of some description. Are you familiar with Mopani worm outbreaks or caterpillar worm outbreaks? No. So in certain parts of southern Africa, mostly in the drier areas of Botswana and Zambia, but in other areas as well, at certain times of the year, but only in certain years, and we don't know what triggers the release of and the growth of millions of caterpillars. And many people, like those in Botswana particularly, use this as the major food source, major protein source in their diet. So they'll collect these caterpillars when they emerge, and the behavior of the caterpillar is such that it'll crawl up the tree, it will eat all the leaves. They go as an army, thousands of caterpillars. You can hear them going scrunch, scrunch, scrunch across the soil and up the tree, and then they go gobble, 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 finished. And then they all go down that trunk, crunching across the soil and up to the next one. So you could have a beautiful piece of Mopani felt or any other kind of felt. 10 minutes later, the Mopani worms have cleaned up. Okay? So in terms of factual evidence, is we think it's got something to do with temperature triggers and allowing the emperor moth larvae to reproduce at a higher rate, because in most cases it's the emperor moths that give rise to many of these different kinds of caterpillars. And the ideas that are out there at the moment is that if 1 or 2 caterpillars come out at a time, the birds eat them all up. So what you've got to do is you've got to saturate the entire environment with enough caterpillars to satiate the birds so that the caterpillars can go on to breeding. So that's why they come out in these major armies of worms. They can completely defoliate a host species over many thousands of square kilometers. They can move from not necessarily the same little caterpillar, but you can get outbreaks of these caterpillars in big waves from northern Botswana into Zambia and up into the Congo. And you can get extensive areas that are defoliated. So you say, what are they doing? They're eating all the leaves. Now, these leaves that they are eating, they only eat nutrient-poor leaves, interesting. They never eat acacias. And so they take these nutrient-poor leaves. If I had to break this leaf off this tree, and I threw it on the ground, and say it weighed 4 grams, for it to go from 4 grams to 2 grams, in other words, lose half its mass from decay, takes about 2 years. It just slowly hangs there, and the environment is dry and it's hot, and it slowly decomposes. If you have a worm eating you, they go up into the canopy, the worm eats you in the front, and as it's eating you, it is sucking out the soluble sugars, mostly, from the leaves, and not bothering to digest all the harder stuff. So it defecates, it poops out all the leftover bits of leaf. So you can go under the tree where the caterpillar has eaten 5 minutes ago, and under the tree you can stand in ankle-deep little brown pellets from the caterpillars. And what they are doing is they are speeding up the rate of nutrient cycling in the system by like 10,000-fold. Because the nutrients that are locked up in this leaf, all that nitrogen, all the phosphorus that built this leaf, is held there until normally the leaf decomposes, which is 2 years or so. But now the caterpillar comes along and goes munch, munch, munch. 10 minutes later, those nutrients are released back into the soil, the plants take them up, and the whole system, it's like resetting it to zero, resetting it back to spring with a whole new amounts of nutrients. So you can see the theme of my talk are little organisms working together with bigger organisms, essentially to provide them with the nutrients they need to become a functional system. So that's kind of the big message today. And then the next crop of trees are of leaves, and then the bird predators tidy up as well. Then you may not have an outbreak for several years. As we're starting to move up in size of organisms and interesting cases, this is an Acacia nigrescens. It has very long, that's the bark, has very long inflorescences like this that flower at very early before the spring rains in many cases. Now, if you've got a very long inflorescence like this, it's full of pollen. You all know what pollen is, that sort of yellow stuff. Pollen is the highest concentration of amino acids, which are little baby nitrogens, of anything you can find anywhere in the world. All right, so instead of you eating a rump steak for supper tonight, just go into the garden and shake off a few pollen grains and go munch, munch, and you're fine. Okay, high concentrations of nitrogen locked up in amino acids. So in our systems, at the end of the dry season, there are essentially very few leaves left on the trees. And the animal that is most stressed at that time of the year in South African savannas is the giraffe. Okay? So the association has been made, and we can't prove it, but at that time of the year when the Acacia nigrescens is flowering, you will see every giraffe with its head stuck in the acacia tree. And it depends what kind of a scientist you are, natural scientists, they will say the elephants are the biggest pollinating agent of everything that we know of. Little pollinators are usually bees or ants or moths or rodents. But many people say as the giraffe comes in and eats this inflorescence, it gets pollen stuck on its snout and it wanders off to the next tree and they pollinate Acacia nigrescens like that. Hard to prove, but the acacias are being pollinated. But the physiological answer is whilst at that time of the year when the giraffes are so stressed because there are no leaves, they can get all of their nitrogen from eating pollen than eating tree leaves. So now we have a big helping hand. It may help pollinate, but it's actually balancing its nitrogen demands for the growth and maintenance of its own body. And then the last story that I'll tell you about is I just put it together in this little collage over here. The question that we're often asked is, what controls tree density in savannas? Is it the tree density means the number of trees in an area? Is it the amount of rainfall? Is it the amount of nutrients? Fundamentally it is, but in many of our situations it's also a combination of fire and how often fire burns in an area, and elephants. And there's lots of debate in South Africa that because of the growing elephant populations in the Kruger Park, that's why there are no big trees any longer. That trees and elephants have always been associated and blah, blah, blah. So you can get ecologists talking for 10 hours around a campfire about what controls tree density. Is it elephants? Is it people? Is it land use change? Is it government policy? Is it fire? All those things. But just one story, or no, it's not a story, it's true. Evidence of a particular tree. This is a Dombea rotundifolia. It flowers very early, also towards the end of the dry season before the spring rains. I think it's the wild pear in common language. And of course, at this time of the year, it's often subjected to fire. And of course, tree density doesn't only change in areas where there are elephants. So we can't say elephants are always responsible for changing the number of trees in a system. And in many of our very dry savannas, this is at Nails Flat, the culprit, the trigger that kills or changes tree density is the porcupine. High densities of porcupines, because of the maize growing in that area. The porcupine wanders out at night, takes a bite out of the base of the tree, because late in the dry season, in these trees, all the sugar and the nitrogen and the phosphorus is stored right close to the ground here, trying to protect the loss from fire. So all the sugars are stored down here. The porcupine needs those nutrients. So the porcupine is at the bottom of the tree, the giraffe's at the top of the tree. Different species, but it's these interactions. So porcupine comes along, takes a bite out of here, causes a scar on the tissue. This scar is seldom given a chance to heal properly with new bark growing over it. So the next fire that comes along burns into this scar and makes it deeper, like a cup shape. Then the wind will blow and another fire will come along and the wind will blow, and through these two factors, the tree will become very lopsided, because it will have a cup-like eaten out of it at the base from the porcupine and the fires. Then eventually the wind will blow that tree over. So in this particular case up at Nails Flat, it was trees and grass, fire, porcupine, and wind, which controlled the tree density in that area. Not any one of those, but a combination of those occurring at different frequencies over the years. So Bob and I continue to stay in Africa, to work here, because there is nowhere in the world where we can go, where we're given the same amount of satisfaction by trying to understand the nexus between people, fire, and animals, and our wonderful diversity. Thank you.